Ruben Rocca is a student at the University of Calabria, attending the master's degree in modern languages and literatures. In 2010, he graduated with honor in linguistic mediation for tourism, discussing the thesis Los marcadores temporales, studio contrastivo spagnolo-italiano. His interest in languages, foreign cultures, and civil aviation led him to work as a port service agent and as a flight attendant. The title of his presentation is Constructing New Identities in a Postcolonial Context.
Okay, thank you. Good evening to everybody. The title of my presentation is Constructing New Identities in a Postcolonial Context. Actually, one of the focuses of postcolonial theory is identity, or a certain identity crisis which leads to anti-essentialist ideas of a subject and multiple identities position. The concept of new identities and multiple identities has become dominant in the context of postcolonial literary works and theory. Identity is not a static sum of different elements, but a very dynamic process, and this presentation aims at showing the development of new postcolonial identities through the study of English novels such as White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and The Shelter by Gabriel Phillips. White Sargasso Sea was published in 1966 and was written as an imagined prequel to Charlotte Bronte Jane Eyre, published in 1847. Also, the two works are divided by more than 100 years of history. Rhys still wanted to give a voice to Bronte's mad woman in the attic, the Creole wife of Edward Rochester. The woman is Antoinette, and White Sargasso Sea is the story of her life before her tragic end at Thornfield Hall. White Sargasso Sea can be considered as a story of being an outsider, where feelings of belonging are determined by racial and social differences. Antoinette, the main character, is a young Creole woman. She lives in between different roles and states of mind, who she thinks she is and who she is expected to be, not knowing which way to go and trying to form an identity that can be accepted by others. Defining Antoinette as a Creole can suggest both that she is a descendant from European settlers in the Western Indies and that she is of mixed ethnic background. So we can identify Antoinette as at least two identities, as a Creole and as a young woman. Additionally, social exclusion due to the loss of her family economic status and physical exclusion due to gender and ethnic background forced Antoinette to become a hybrid. Therefore, she shapes a new identity, and I quote, "So between you and I often wonder who I am, and where is my country, and where do I belong, and why was I ever born at all?" According to Cholkovsky, not quite English and not quite native, Rhys Creole woman straddled the embattled divide between human and savage, core and periphery, self and other. Described as a Creole, she is neither black nor white, but somewhere in between Europe and the Caribbean, a slave and a master in a world where, due to decolonization, new identities and roles have to be performed in ways never experienced before. In Antoinette, this creates an uncertainty of identity and belonging. Moreover, Homi Bhabha, in his The Location of Culture, discusses how we shape our identity, and I quote, "How our subjects formed in between or in excess of the sum of the parts of difference, usually intoned as a race, class, and gender, and etc." According to Bhabha, this kind of living in between multiple identities leads to a form of hybridity, an ambivalent state of mind where there is no longer a specific place or home, but mixed feelings over the fact that nothing is stable anymore. We find ourselves in the moment of transit where space and time cross to produce complex figures of difference and identity, past and present, inside and outside, inclusion and exclusion. Being constantly excluded and rejected due to one's background creates a never-ending cycle that is impossible to escape from. The hybrid is not let into any social community because of the threat he or she poses to the community identity. In conclusion, Antoinette can be considered as a hybrid because of her gender, economic status, and ethnic background. She failed in the attempt of shaping an identity that can be accepted into a community, and this is the reason why finally she decided to end her life in a world that does not recognize her. Things Fall Apart was written by Nigerian author Chinua Achebe and published in 1958, drawing the downfall of the main character Okonkwo while dealing with the arrival of the British colonial powers in Nigeria during the late 19th century. The novel is a story about personal beliefs, customs, and also a story about an identity confliction. There is a struggle between family, culture, and religion of the Igbo tribes. It shows how things fall apart when these beliefs and customs are challenged and how a personal identity changes for a man. It also represents the deterioration of national identity. The story concerns the life of Okonkwo who is internally challenged and slowly becomes someone that is no longer recognizable by his friends or his family. When Okonkwo faces changes, his identity starts to fade. Okonkwo, the main character, is an Igbo man who is a local wrestling champion in his town Umuofia. He strives to make his way in a world that seems to value only manliness, so he achieves great social and financial success by embracing his ideals and his community's traditions. And I quote, Okonkwo was well known throughout the 9 villages and even beyond. His fame rested on the solid personal achievements. As a young man of 18, he had brought honor to his village by throwing Amalins at the cut. Okonkwo is characterized by hard working, strength, self-confidence, and thoroughness, which is the complete opposite of his father's character. And I quote, Okonkwo ruled his household with a heavy hand. Perhaps down in his heart, Okonkwo was not a cruel man. Okonkwo was ruled by one passion to hate everything that his father Rocca had loved. One of those things was gentleness and another was idleness. Okonkwo's reaction to the white colonizers brings interesting elements about his identity, and I quote, perhaps I had been away too long, Okonkwo said almost to himself, but I cannot understand these things you tell me. What is it that happened to our people? Why they have lost their power to fight? Why did they not fight back? We must fight these men and drive them from the land. Clearly, Okonkwo was the only one who refused to surrender to the changes that the white forced on them, and he was trying hard to convince his brothers from the village to fight back, but unfortunately, most of his brothers have turned into Christianity and gave up their land to the white powers. Okonkwo represents the essential subjectivity of Nigerian national identity against the attack of white colonizers. He represents also the authenticity of an ethnic identity, and his figure is tied to the concept of aboriginality. In other words, the hard defense of the status and values of being indigenous. And I quote, the white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one. He has put a knife on these things that held us together, and we had fallen apart. Okonkwo is having a battle within himself as a reaction to what happened to his country. He does not only blame the white for what happened, he also blames his brothers who convert to Christianity and easily letting down everyone else instead of fighting back, defending their beliefs and customs. In the effort to preserve the residuals of his national aboriginality through the resistance to the white colonial hegemony, Okonkwo identity suffered many changes. Those changes led to the downfall of the main character. His tragic flaw was his inability to accept the drastic or radical changes that came upon his village. He felt that the whites were not manly enough to lead his country, and he will not be a man if he falls to their control. He was afraid to lose his social status if he did not resist. Okonkwo's inability to accept radical changes in his identity led him to a tragic end, and I quote, they came to the tree from which Okonkwo's body was dangling, and they stopped that. Perhaps your man can help us bring him down and bury him, said Obiorika. Also, Obiorika turned to the commissioner and said ferociously, that man was one of the greatest men in the Umuofia. You drove him to kill himself, and now he will be buried like a dog. In conclusion, Okonkwo is a tragic hero in the classical sense, and instead of using his power that he had as the strongest character to help his country, he walked into his own hand just because he couldn't keep up with the changes of his identity. His individualism cannot help him to shape a new identity in order to survive to the white culture. The Shelter is a play work written by fictitious British writer Carol Phillip in 1983 and staged at the Lyric Theatre of Hammersmith in 1984. The Shelter is a play in 2 acts, each involving a black man and a white woman, one set on a desert island in the 18th century and the other taking place in London in the 1950s. In The Shelter are history and society that condition the way mixed couples relate to each other. 2 couples living an interval of some 200 years are stuck by a similar incapacity to connect with the racial and sexual others. In the first act, taking place at the end of the 18th century, a black man and a white woman called Him and Her are stranded on a desert island after the shipwreck of their vessel. Also, they are physically away from society and its constraints. The 2 characters find it impossible to go beyond the prejudice imposed by 200 years old history. Him and Her are unable to begin anew, and I quote, I see your father in the face of every white man, and I discern, and I am 200 years old now and getting older. I wonder where you will die and we can begin anew. At the same time, Her is equally chained, destined to echo the awful piety of previous people. The second act, set in London in 1950s, focuses on Louis and Irene. Irene is pregnant by Louis, but the 2 are about to part, defeated as it were by the pressure of society. The surrounding racism and people gaze in particular have taken their toll on Louis, who declares, these people, they break you by smiling at you one day and ignoring you the next, by their hateful toleration, by crossing the damn road when they see the 2 of us coming. Louis is the depressed black man who regards himself confusedly, first as a British subject and then as a British object. Irene is a vulnerable English woman convinced that the relationship can continue, and I quote, we can make it work, but we just have to try harder than the others. In spite of Irene's pregnancy, however, the couple cannot stand the pressure of racism in the London of 1950s and the look of English people. And I quote, Louise, nigger and nigger lover, they don't really hate the colored man with a brick in one hand and terror in his eyes, for they are used to that from slavery days. What they are not used to is colored men with white woman on one arm and spring in his step. Phillips grew up confused about his Caribbean heritage, and in his novel he talks about the discomfort of being torn between British and West Indian culture. In the context of resettlement and alienation, Phillips explores how new identities are created, destroyed, and recreated as the people going through the experience are driven into rethinking their own conception of identity and of their nationality. The characters Him, Her, Louis, and Irene can be considered as fragmented identities that live in the memory fragments. These identities are still attached to the post-colonial experience, and they are also victims of prejudice and racism in a transnational reality. The works of Carey Phillips may be viewed as reminders of the fact that the repercussions of colonialism are still very much a problem of the present. In conclusion, this scheme summarized new identities that emerge in a post-colonial context. We have seen Antoniette is considered as a hybrid identity because she lives between 2 cultures. She is an uncertain identity. Hybridity leads her to suicide, which represents a form of escape from social and physical exclusion. Okonkwo is an aboriginal and ethnic identity. The confrontation with radical changes produces a deterioration of his identity, which also represents the fall of national identity. His individualism leads him to suicide, intended as an extreme defense of his authentic identity. And finally, the 4 identities, Him, Her, Louis, and Irene, can be considered as fragmented identities. They are the result of a colonial past and prejudice, and this leads to the incapacity to connect with the racial and sexual others. This was my contribution, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ruben.